Hey guys, welcome back to another video. My name is Theo, and today we're going to be going over Octane Render for beginners. I'm going to be giving you all the advice that I would want as a beginner getting started in Octane. By the way, if you are interested in learning more about Octane, if you're a beginner or advanced user, you can check out my Octane Render Masterclass in the link below. We cover everything from the very core principles, such as sampling in the different render kernels, to more advanced concepts such as render passes, compositing, and shading. So if you're interested in learning more about Octane, you can check out the class in the link below. It is the third update, which is free to everyone who has purchased the class before in the past. Okay guys, let's jump right in right here and let's talk a little bit about this scene, some of my artistic choices, and how I used Octane Render and its features to kind of create them. So what I have here is this really abstract scene that I wanted to make. I wanted to kind of contain nature in this black void, this box right here. And what I'm using to do that is like this glass, this is a very simple, just specular material with some roughness. And then what's really interesting about this scene, and this is something that I think as a beginner, this is what I did, and I see a lot of beginners doing, is they tend to overcomplicate their lighting. Because you're inside of CG, you have unlimited lighting resources, essentially. So in the real world, you're restrained to how many stands you have, how many lights you have, the placement of the lights. But inside of CG, you can make your lights invisible, you can place them, you can resize them, you can change the temperature, change the color of them. There's a limitless combination of how you can use lighting. And if you're a beginner, you tend to overcomplicate that and put too much light in your scene. And there's two reasons this is bad for your renders and your render times. The first reason it's bad is the more lights you have, the more balancing you have to do in your image. So I only have two lights in the scene. I have a key light right here, and then I have a fill light right here. If I were to have 10, 20 lights in the scene, I'd have to balance all the lights in their different weight in the scene. And the more lights you add, the harder it is to get more value variation within your scene, which is also very detrimental to how it could look potentially. So what I would recommend you doing is limit yourself in the beginning. 3 lights maximum. 3-point lighting is really all you need. You can create a beautiful image with 3-point lighting in the right render kernels and settings. So let's talk a little bit else about lighting. The reason I like to use a low amount of lights also is because your renders will resolve faster. So the more lights you throw into your scene, the more samples are going to have to find the different lights. So this is how Octane works. You have your camera, and it's going to fire a certain amount of samples per pixel, the amount that you assign. Right here I have our render settings, so I'm assigning 2,500 samples per pixel. That means for every single pixel in this scene, Octane is going to fire 2,500 samples for that pixel. All those samples that Octane fires from the camera are going to have to go into the scene, bounce a certain amount of times. So for our diffuse it's 16, for our specular it's 16, and for our scatter it's 16 as well. Not only is it bouncing throughout the scene, but it's also having to find a light. If you have a lot of lights, it's going to have to find more lights, which is going to make your image resolve slower. Also, if you have a lot of small lights, it's going to have to find a smaller light source, which is going to take more samples to resolve the noise within your image. So let me show you a quick example of this. I'm just going to create a new project real quick. We're not even going to jump into ACES color space or anything. I'm just going to I'm going to jump into the path tracing kernel, and I'm going to show you a great example of this. So let's drop in an HDRI, and then let's drop in a Octane area light. So we'll go to lights, Octane area light, and then I just want to drop in we'll do a plane and a sphere. Let's pull this area light back some. And what I'm going to do here is just create some noise real quick for you and kind of show you how this were to work. So if I take this light, rotate it right here. So to demonstrate this, I built a very quick scene. We have two lights in this scene. We have light 1 and light 2. Light 1 is a very big light. It's like the regular size when you drop in a light. And light 2 is the same brightness as light 1 because I unchecked surface brightness right there. So if you uncheck surface brightness and you resize the light, it's going to maintain the same brightness value that it was assigned. While it's the same brightness, it's much, much smaller. And the reason I did this is because I wanted to show you this right here. We're shooting through this right here in the path tracing kernel, so we're getting caustics. If we were to jump out of the path tracing kernel into direct lighting, we would get no caustics. Even jumping into diffuse or none or ambient occlusion, you're not getting caustics in direct lighting. So this will only work in the path tracing kernel. However, this idea that I'm going to share with you applies to all kernels, and that is that different size lights need different sample rates. So this is another reason I don't like to use a lot of lights, especially a lot of small lights. What we have here are light 1 and light 2. And I'm going to turn off light 2, and we're going to start off with light 1. I'm going to compare and store render buffer. But first, let's just give our scene a total of 200 samples. So we're only rendering 200 samples. This is a very low sample rate, but it's going to make sense because I'm going to show you why this is so important. I'm going to store this render buffer right here. So we have light 1, that's going to be this render buffer here. Let's turn on light 2, let's turn off light 1, and we're going to give light 2 the same amount of samples, only 200. Let's take a look at the noise difference between these two. So yes, light 1 or light 2 is smaller than light 1, but that's not going to affect, or that shouldn't affect, how much noise we have. However, we have much more hot pixels with the smaller light than with the bigger light, and that's because the samples are having a harder time of finding the light source. Remember, the camera is firing the samples, they're bouncing throughout the scene, and they're trying to find the light source. The light source is smaller, it's going to have a much harder time finding those samples. If I were to drop a third light in and make it huge, it would have a much easier time of finding those samples. So, keeping this in mind, what can we do to resolve this image faster? If we had both these lights in the scene at the same time, that is. Well, what I would want to do is increase the sample rate of our light 2 because it's smaller. How much would I increase the sample rate by? Well, like I said, if we have both the lights in the scene, they're both going to matter. So let's go ahead and drop them both in, and we'll just drop them side by side. Let's move this light over. You can see right here, even in the shadow, how our light 2 is much noisier than our light 1, just to prove that again. What do I want to do here? Well, what I want to do is I want to increase the sample rate by this light by the amount of times it's smaller than our biggest light. So in this case, we have light 2 right here, and light 2 looks like it's roughly 20 times smaller. Let's start off with 20 and see what happens. So we'll go to our sampling rate of light 2. Let's increase it to 20. There we go. Not bad. It looks like it needs to be increased a little more. Let's increase it to, let's say, 50. And there we go, much closer. Let's do 100. And it looks like they're resolving roughly at the same rate now. I might even go higher and do a sampling rate of 200. Yep, and that's pretty accurate and pretty close right there. If we wanted to, we could keep taking it higher. We could do 700. And there we go. I don't want to go too high because then I'm going to start offsetting the samples, and it's going to start making this light actually noisier. So you want to find a nice balance. In this case, I did 700 times. That might be a little too much, but it's going to show us a more extreme example. So what I do here is, what we're saying here is we want to fire 700 more samples, or sample rates, for this light than for the other light. That's giving this light more attention. Now, keep in mind, you'll see that it's made the rest of our image much more noisy. So maybe 700 was a little too much. We'll go back to 200 right here. So you're taking samples away from your other light. Just keep that in mind as well. You can see how this image was much less noisy than this image right here. That's another reason I like to use less lights. So just for this whole like optimizations, from an optimization and then from a control standpoint, you don't need to use a massive amounts of lights inside of Octane Render. If you're trying to create a beautiful scene, it's not necessary. Just keep it simple. Especially if you're a beginner, you need to focus more on different things like lighting fundamentals, how to make what you have work. I like to limit myself to 3 lights unless I'm doing a bunch of practical lights. That's just simply something that I do. A lot of amazing, beautiful images have been created on just a 3-point or less lighting system. But let's talk a little bit more about materials and the weight they hold inside of our scene, because materials also play a huge role. When it comes to talking about lighting inside of CG, I never have a lighting conversation without a material conversation, because I'm gonna show you this, and this is why. Because we're working inside the world of CG, inside the world of visual effects, we can control every aspect of our image, including the material properties of our subjects. So in this case, I'm going to talk about the floor. I love shiny reflective floors. I think they look so crazy and amazing. This is something that's very hard to achieve in real life because you have to do a wet down to get this kind of look. But inside of CG, it's a simple slide of our roughness button. So first thing we want to do is I'm going to just disconnect our roughness and bump, and we're going to start off with a base glossy material. In this case, I have turned this material almost 100% black, and that's because I don't want this floor to hold too much weight in our scene. And I'll show you what I mean. Is if I were to increase the brightness of this floor, it's going to hold more weight in the scene because it's more prominent. I'm not so interested in the floor in this scene. I'm interested more in our tree, which is the subject in the cloud. So what I'm going to do is slide this down, and something else you'll see is we'll get more color reflection inside of our floor, and that's because as our diffuse decreases, it becomes less prominent. So as we go closer to black, the diffuse value holds less weight, and it's giving more color to the roughness and reflection channels. So let's just, and specular as well. Let's take that down to, let's do 8% right there. So keep in mind, just the color of your material has a big impact. But let's talk a little bit more specific. I want to talk a little bit more about our roughness and our bump. So for now, I'll plug this into our bump, and I'll plug this into our roughness right here. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding detail to this surface, just using noise. Another big thing that I did as a beginner is I never really used noise that much, because if used incorrectly, noise can look very cheesy and it just can look bad, honestly. Like, you need to use it properly. But if you understand how these different octaves, omegas, and gamma and contrast work, you can craft noise that looks pretty good and realistic like this. If I were to use an image as a texture here, I could get tiling very, very easily. So that's another reason I like to use noise. It's very random, and it can, in a lot of ways, reflect reality. So let's talk a little bit about this noise parameter and what it's doing. We're just using a simple noise with an XYZ to UVW projection. The reason we're using that projection is because that is the noise that's the texture space that the Cinema4d noise works in. So that's the texture space I always put the Octane noise to work in. It's basically a box projection or triplanar projection for your noise. It's just the noise texture space. And then I just drop a transform on there. I always like to transform independently of my texture projection, because what I'll end up doing a lot of times is adding a bunch of noises in, and I don't want them to inherit this noise's transformation value. So I'll just make a separate transformation value for all the noises. So what is this noise doing? Well, we're driving this noise right here. And what I'll do is I'll show you a visual representation of this noise. So let's go ahead and solo this noise out. By left clicking and clicking solo, or just clicking D, you can see your noise represented in a color value. So in this case, what's happening is our blacker values are sinking lower down and our whiter values are getting pulled up more, and that's creating this surface variation in this scene. And then what I'm doing here is I'll kind of explain a little bit about what's happening. So you can think of octaves as like the amount of times the noise is iterated on. So as we go higher and higher, there are more iterations are added to this noise, which it becomes more and more detailed. Eventually we get to a point to where adding more octaves doesn't really do anything to our material. So at that point, I kind of stopped around 9 right there, which looked plenty fine, highly detailed enough for me. And then we have omega, which is essentially adding variation to our octaves. So as we slide that up, you notice if we take our omega all the way down, we get these big chunky blocks. If we take it up, we start to get some disruption to these blocks. And if we were to keep going up, we'd have total disruption. For material like this, I don't want total disruption. I want some order to the chaos, because that's usually how reality works. You have some order in the variation. So I like to take this down somewhere right here, maybe a little bit higher, so we have some more surface detail. And then we have gamma and contrast. These are pretty simple. Contrast is going to increase the differences between your darks and highlights, and gamma is going to shift how that curve is mapping to those two. So if we were to take our gamma up in this case, it's going to make it darker. If we were to take it down, it's going to make it brighter. This is going to affect how our bump looks, and I'll prove that by disabling the solo node right here. And then watch what happens when I shift this gamma down. It's making it very, very diffuse, and as I pull it up, it's making it very, very reflective. So the purpose of this is to find a sweet spot. I feel like this is too reflective. This almost looks like water, so I'm going to take this down a little bit more. I want some surface hits, but not too many. That might be too much. I'll go back up. And it's just about finding an artistic balance in your scene. That might be too high, so we'll go down right there. Also, another thing I'm doing is I'm mapping through a gradient. In this case, this gradient isn't doing anything, but gradients are nice to make very quick and easy changes in your scene. So actually, I do have this gradient doing something. I'm clamping our white values in this case. So if I were to bring it down more, you can kind of see what's happening. It's making it more reflective. So in this case, I'm clamping that higher right there. So everything has some sort of sheen or reflection on it. If I were to take this all the way to white and pull it down, we're going to get a very, very contrasty, reflective image right there. So just map everything through a gradient as well. Like using a visual tool as a gradient to control how a texture is mapping or how a texture is looking is very easy because there's a direct correlation between the color and what's happening on the screen. However, you don't have to just use gradients. There are also such things as floats. So I have a float right here. I'm going to throw that in. I'm going to just plug that into our bump. This would probably serve us better for this example to do it in our roughness. So I'm just going to plug it into the roughness right there. So if we have a value of 0, this is essentially completely black. So 0 maps to black, that makes sense. And then 1 maps to white, and that gives us a almost completely diffuse surface, except we have specular. So if we had taken out specular as well, we'd get a completely diffuse surface. In that, we can also just do that by going to diffuse and hitting diffuse right there. Now we have a completely diffuse surface. So you can quickly switch between materials just by clicking that as well. So we can remap this with numbers, but like I said, we could also remap this with colors. So something you need to realize is that RGB spectrum, as far as the value of it is concerned, it's going to behave essentially exactly like a float. So if I were to take this down to black, it's going to do the same thing as our float going down to 0. If I were to take this up to white, it's going to do the same thing as our float mapping all the way up to 1. Now, the middle gray is different. Like, it's going to perform slightly differently in here. So if I were to put our float at 0.5, it's not necessarily going to give us 50% gray. So keep that in mind as well. You can use numbers, textures, image textures, noises to create surface variations. In this case, I just did something very simple with a bump and roughness mapping into the same channel, giving us this nice broken up look, which I really, really like. All of this might sound, maybe to some people it might be crazy. It's like, why would you put so much detail and thought into your floor? Well, because this floor holds weight in the scene, and I get to decide as an artist how much weight it holds in the scene. Another piece of advice I have is to use render passes. So if we were to go to our render settings right here, I'm going to be inside the Octane render space because I'm using Octane currently. If I were to go to our AOVs right here, we can disable and enable different passes. So we could take reflection passes, shadow passes, volume passes. This is a very useful pass in this case because it's going to show us our cloud. Let me re-render on Octane. And then what's going to happen is we'll actually see our passes appear in the bottom right here. So if you're ever confused as if what exactly a certain material is doing, does this material have like a high subsurface scattering amount, so have a high transmission amount, you can actually just check them right here, and then you can check yourself by clicking on the different tabs that appear in the bottom. So if we click enable right here on our passes, then you'll see we have a reflection pass, a transmission pass, which is right there. In this case, all of these plants are transmissive. So let me jump to the other camera to prove that to you. And this is because this is how this material is built. They're built using a transmission filter on them. We have a shadow pass as well. We have a volume pass, and then we have a noise pass as well. These are just the passes I selected. If we wanted to, we could deselect them. And how you use these passes does matter. They will have different blending modes. You can do different types of compositing, so you could rebuild your beauty completely if that's something you're interested in. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. Or you could do something like subtractive compositing, where you take the pass, subtract it, and then add it back in, and then you put all your corrections of that pass on your addition filter. So keep all of that in mind as well. Passes are very, very important to creating a very realistic image and taking it to the next level. For example, in this scene, what I might do if I were to take this into Photoshop or Nuke is click a transmission pass on here, and we have our transmission, and then I could independently control the color, the brightness, the hue, the value of these plants, and not manipulate the whole image, which is something you would be interested in, especially if you're mixing this with reality. In this case, this is full CG, so it's not as important. Another cool thing you could do real quick is, this is something I do very often, is I do my post pass separately, and then I'll, in this case, it's not too bad. I like how it's, how the post is playing, but sometimes like I wouldn't want a bloom on a certain aspect. So like maybe this cloud is a little too bloomy. It's pulling a little bit too much attention from the eye in the scene. So what I might do in this case is I'd go into Photoshop, create a mask, and just darken this a little bit so it's not so bright and so punchy, and it's not taking up so much attention in the render. So keep that in mind. You can easily do all this, and when working with passes, it's very important, especially if you're in the ACES color space, and just in general, because you're going to be doing linear images, you want to use EXRs. EXRs are built for linear images. They are specifically designed for linear images. Do you need to do 32 bits per channel? Not necessarily. You can most of the time get away with 16 bits per channel. Also, there are different compression types. It goes in order from least amount of compression to most amount of compression. I believe after PRX 24, it becomes lossless compression, so you're losing information in your image, but before that it's lossy compression. So this will compress your image, but you will get all of your detail and information back from that image, so keep that in mind as well. Also, potentially some of these, well actually all of these potentially could, depending on what kind of compositing program you're using, slow down your compositor, but there really is no need to work with uncompressed files. I would definitely do whatever type of compression is best suited for your workflow and your compositing program as well. So guys, I hope that was a little bit enlightening. I wanted to throw in as much quick information as possible to kind of build a scene like this. This is a fairly simple scene, just using a few materials, a few different tools inside of Cinema4d and Octane to build an image like this. If you want to learn how I break down, how I build my renders, everything from materials to lighting to sampling, to even like just the artistic side of like approaching a scene, you can check out the Octane Render Masterclass in the link below. Like I said, this is a class that I built that I would have wanted when I first got started. This is all the information that I would have loved to have had. So you can check out the link below if you're interested, and I will see y'all in the next video. Peace out.